and I would like to speak about, as it has been mentioned, an unholy heritage of neoliberal monarchy. Uh, First of all, some words about the two main points which will be on the table, the roots of neoliberalism and the Habsburg Empire. And after that, I would like to put an emphasis on the other heritage of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which is the cooperation of Austro-Marxism and the Hungarian social democracy. And after that, I would like to make some conclusions on the field of social democracy. Some words about this project. This paper argues that neoliberalism, which has traditionally been taken as a Western phenomenon, do have Eastern origins. Moreover, Eastern Europe played a crucial role how neoliberalism maintained the globalized capitalism. I put an emphasis on the fact that Eastern Europe has constantly been some kind of birthplace of an experimental laboratory for neoliberal capitalism. This paper examines, on the one hand, the impact of Vienna intellectuals on the Hungarian neoliberal tradition unfolding after the collapse of Austro-Hungarian Empire. On the other hand, the ideological and political cooperation of Austro-Marxism and Hungarian social democracy in exile during the interwar period in Vienna. This paper aims to investigate the interwar and post-war neoliberalism and left-wing alternatives, and will conclude that fascism and neoliberalism simultaneously try to destroy social democracy. By the way, this paper and this investigation is a part of my upcoming book project on Eastern and Western origins of neoliberalization of the Kádár regime in Hungary, and I try to dig as deep as I can and to put an emphasis on the very, very early origins of the Hungarian neoliberalization tendencies, and it has been the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the intellectual and political theoretical background of the monarchy. So the first point is about the roots of neoliberalism and the Habsburg Empire. First of all, the early theoretical origins and antecedents of embedded neoliberalism, and put an emphasis on this phrase used by Béla Greskovics and Dorothy Ball, embedded neoliberalism in historical scales. So these antecedents of embedded neoliberalism have been analyzed in the framework of Austro-Hungarian Empire. The Habsburg Empire was one of the main cradles of neoliberalism, as Queen Slobodian argues. There is a quote: "It traces neoliberal globalism as an intellectual project that began in the ashes of the Habsburg Empire," quote ends. The main players in this field were first of all Ludwig von Mises and Friedrich Hayek. Moreover, who belonged to the Vienna intellectuals and maintained the neoliberal ideas. It is to say that the views of neoliberalism on globalization also rooted in the Central European perspectives, because after the fall of Austro-Hungarian Empire, it was Central Europe neoliberals who most consistently looked at the world as a whole. The internationalism of neoliberalism elaborated by Hayek is very rooted in the multi-ethnic and multilingual framework of Austro-Hungarian Empire, which has become such a lost object of identification for many Viennese-raised intellectuals. This had a significant impact on the Hungarian neoliberal tradition, as Joanna Bockman and Jill Eyal argues very sharply. There was a exchange of ideas on neoliberalism. The roots of this rapid and strong embrace of neoliberalism reside in the transnational network composed of both American and Eastern European economists. The second subpoint is about the Austro School of Economics, the legacy of monarchy. One of the most important pillars, one could say, the cradle of neoliberalism that unfolded between the two world wars, was the Austrian or Viennese School of Economics, which in many ways also defined the Austro-Hungarian monarchy and which represented the heterodox approach. The origins of the school are dated back to the book The Principle of Economics by Karl Menger, published in 1971. Menger's book was the defining achievement of the marginalist revolution in the history of economics. Beside Menger, the leading figure of the first generation of this movement were the mentioned in the previous day, Eugen Böhm-Bawerk and Friedrich von Wieser. The second generation was much more structured and represented different approaches. Its key figure had a strong influence on the neoliberal approach that emerged between the two world wars, and its members were also part of the institutionalization and consolidation phase of neoliberalism. Joseph Schumpeter, Ludwig von Mises, and Hayek are thus prominent in this respect. The central approach of the movement, beyond the economic defense of laissez-faire and economic freedom, is the philosophical and political theoretical underpinning of both these tendencies and the strict rejection of state intervention. The First World War brought the end of the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the golden age of the Austrian school. It was in the context of Great Depression that Hayek's unquestioning views were crystallized as he proposed the free operation of price mechanism and the elimination of investments and projects not justified by consumer demand. The vehement advocacy of laissez-faire ended with the victory of Keynes and postponed the success of neoliberal trend until after the Second World War. A key point for the Hungarian prehistory of neoliberalism is that Mises had a significant influence of Hungarian public and economic thought. In 1925, at an invitation of Cobden Society, he visited Hungary and gave a lecture on the reorganization of European public finances. It is worth mentioning that the association itself, I mean the Cobden Society, was founded by young merchants in 1921. The name is a tribute to Richard Cobden, the liberal member of the House of Commons, who spoke against the grain duty, persecuted all measures restricting economic activity, and supported the Hungarian emigration of 1949 as a pacifist. The Cobden Society published the Cobden Journals and several books and raised a huge intellectual impact at that time. The society believed that economic and cultural issues were inextricably linked and that economic liberalization could unfold within a cultural or theoretical framework. In a summary of the mentioned 1925 lecture, the Passionopoulos quotes Mises as saying the following about nationalization of public services, which significantly foreshadows what the neoliberal approach will expect from the state to ensure and maintain market conditions. There is a quote from this journal: "All the gold that governments have touched has turned to dust. Only one thing helps here: government and cities should sell all their utilities to entrepreneurs who can make them profitable." It's very remarkable. There is talk on commercializing public utilities. This is, of course, nothing more than empty slogan. Commercial management is not something that can just be tagged on to a public utility. Commercial management means that companies are run by managers who are responsible for their own profits and losses. Public officials are always bureaucrats, no matter how conscientious and skilled they may be, quote ends. So downsizing must begin with the elimination of superfluous state agendas, first and foremost by cutting public utilities. It's very remarkable at the early stage of the 21st century. In 1932, following the economic crisis, Mises again gave a lecture in Budapest entitled "The Great Economic Crisis and Capitalism" at the invitation of Hungarian Economic Society in a banquet hall of the Chamber of Commerce and Industry. The other journal, Magyar Hilap, argued and summarized the main ideas of the lecture in the following. The general perception today is that the current economic crisis is in fact a crisis of capitalism. The concern is that capitalism will collapse to make a way for socialism. This was believed in the time of Marx and Engels, but it is wrong. Indeed, the current crisis is very serious, and its most striking symptom is the permanent unemployment of millions of workers. This is not, however, a fault of capitalism, but on the contrary, the consequence of a system which seeks to tie capitalism down, which seeks to weaken the strength of capitalism. It's therefore wrong to think that capitalism has outlived itself and that what wasn't a complete impossibility is that the harmful policy of anti-capitalism is driven by the aim of destroying the functions of the market. Quote ends. Mises' thesis also indicate that neoliberalism, which is crystallizing on the basis of the views of Austrian school, among others, stands in sharp contrast to the both socialism and idea of liberalism, which seeks to shackle the state for the sake of the markets. Neoliberalism's main mission will be precisely to strengthen the state for the sake of the market, among other things, by dismantling public services and the welfare state that emerged in Europe after the Second World War. The second point is about our second historical and political theoretical pillar is the Hayek and its impact on the Montpellierin society. First of all, it is worth to mention that Walter Lippmann colloquium in 1938 can be considered the formal birthplace of neoliberalism as an intellectual movement. The primary sources studied so far also show that there were many different neoliberal ideas before, but with the colloquium, the Walter Lippmann colloquium, neoliberalism gained intellectual coherence despite the internal struggle of contradictory tendencies. Walter Lippmann was a German-born American writer, reporter, and political commentator whose book, the well-known The Good Society, brought together representatives of the German and French liberal intellectual elite at the initiative of the French philosopher Louis Rogier. The Lippmann meetings were the frontrunner of the Montpellierin Society founded by Hayek. Drawing on the experience of this colloquium, a new and successful attempt to organize a neoliberal movement was made after the Second World War. Under the leadership of Albert Humboldt and Hayek, a number of European and of course American neoliberal intellectuals who were then only loosely connected gathered in the Swiss village of Montpellierin between the 1st and 10th of April in 1947. That something has changed fundamentally from similar attempts between the two world wars, and that the possibilities for building a neoliberal network were almost limitless was shown by the fact that the meetings were supported by the major players, the big capital. For instance, the Foundation of Economic Education, based in Irvington, Hudson in New York State, where Mises worked, by the way, the Kansas City-based Volcker Fund, headed by Harold Lunow, who later became a key member of the Montpellierin movement, and the Socialistische Anstalt, known as the Credit Suisse, it's an investment bank, which provided substantial funding for the meetings. Among other founding members, we find the following prominent neoliberal thinkers alongside Hayek: Frank Knight, Karl Popper, Mises, Fritz Machel, George Stigler, Milton Friedman, Henry Hazlitt, Wilhelm Röpke, who, by the way, led the German currency stabilization, and Veronica Wedgworth. One of the main aims of the meetings and resulting institutionalization was to gain influence. The participants were aware that they had little influence on policymakers in an era where social economic planning and socialism were beginning to emphasize in the wake of the collapse of the World War. So the first and utmost impact of this stage of neoliberalism was the policy and political and politics implication of emerging neoliberalism. The other aim was that since, according to Hayek, classic liberalism had failed, it should be balanced by the creation of a new liberal intellectual network. Some impacts of this institutionalization of new neoliberalism. Central and Eastern European societies were shocked by the regime change of the late 90s. History didn't end, but in some respects, the existing world order did. The economic and world political failure of the alternative system to global capitalism, it has the existing state socialism, which had been considered viable at least until then. This, in turn, made the economic, political, and social integration of the former Soviet sphere of interest in the Central and Eastern European countries of the West irreversible. Above all, the change in public law resulted in the construction of Eastern clones of the post-war constitutional democracies of Western Europe. New constitution replaced the Soviet constitutional structure with a constitutional system of liberal democracy. However, the process of public and political westernization is embedded in the process of economic regime changes and reintegration of the Central and Eastern European semi-periphery into the global capitalism, which had begun much earlier. It has been claimed here that the rapid and shocking dissolution of the countries Eastern European region, including Hungary, into the global capitalism occurred precisely because it was prepared by the gradual and multi-level neoliberal approach. In addition, besides the external, geo and world political causes and constraints, the neoliberalization was successful because the state socialist experiment found itself in opposition to the Eastern antecedents of neoliberalism, analyzed before, which were increasingly embedded in the changing Kader regime itself. In this way, it is fair to say that Fukuyama was wrong about the end of the history, and the liberal democracy didn't become a universal political system, but that regime change could only have taken place because neoliberal capitalism penetrated state socialist systems and reform communists and reform economists who had been involved in dismantling this system from within since at least 1970s or even before, had a fundamental influence on the character of neoliberalism. Some words about the counter tendencies and counter movements, unfortunately failed counter movements against the emerging early neoliberal roots and neoliberal tendencies. This is Austro-Marxism and Hungarian social democrats. The first point goes to Red Vienna and the early counter-concept of neoliberalism. On the ruins of monarchy rose not only neoliberalism, but also a counter-concept opposing the early stages of emerging neoliberalism. The Red Vienna can be interpreted as a political and ideological consequence of collapse of Habsburg Empire, and the Hungarian social democracy was interlinked with and influenced by this tradition. Karl Polanyi argues very sharply, there is a quote, when in Central Europe the social structure broke down under the strain of war or defeat, the working class alone was available for the task of keeping things going. Everywhere, power was thrust upon the trade unions and social democratic parties, Austria and Hungary, quote ends. The Red Vienna project can be seen as an early counter-concept or alternative to the inter and post-war neoliberalization analyzed here. The main outcomes of the anti-neoliberal assumptions are the implemented policies of improved standards of public education, public housing, healthcare, and sanitation. It is worth to mention that the collapse of the Austro-Hungarian Empire caused several social tensions and migration crises. Vienna underwent a host of demographic change that partly exacerbated the economic issues in the city in the years both during and immediately after the war. Refugees from Austrian Galicia, including roughly 25,000 Jews seeking to avoid the political violence of the Russian Civil War that had spread to the area, had settled in the capital city. Just a quick footnote here, because it can be very, very important that in the 1970s, Hayek wrote regularly regularly articles in the Time, and that maybe around 1977 he wrote about that at the interwar periods the immigrant Jews were not able to being consolidated in this period. It cannot be integrated to the Vienna society. Of course, Hayek was blamed with anti-Semitic tendencies, but it's very, very important that for him, this social structural integration was very important all the time. The intellectual resources of Red Vienna were remarkable. Karl Polanyi and his wife, Ilona Luczynska, as well as several other socialist intellectuals relocated to Vienna or went there in exile, from elsewhere. In addition, the city's native Sigmund Freud, Attila Antal, Karl Bühner, Karl Kraus, and others were the intellectual background of this situation. Many other scientists, artists, publishers, architects, respectively. Polanyi argues very well, there is a quote, Vienna achieved one of the most spectacular cultural triumphs of Western history, quote ends. The Austro-Marxists responded to the post-war social crisis and intellectual crisis, and the creation of interwar workforce system has become the main agenda for Red Vienna. Creating public housing projects became the main concern of the Social Democrats. In 1919, the Housing Requirement Act was passed in the federal parliament with the intention to ease pressure on the housing situation in Vienna. Low private demand for building land and low building costs provides favorable for the city administration extensive public housing planning from the 1921 to 1944. More than 60,000 new apartments were built in the municipal buildings, the well-known Gemeindebau project. The second point is about the Hungarian Social Democrats in exile. Austro-Marxism and the Hungarian Social Democracy interlinked in the interwar period. Given the fact that Red Vienna hosts internal exiled left-wingers of the Hungarian Social Democratic Party, the collapse of the monarchy has started a different process compared to the Austria. As Balageva argues, in 1919, the majority of the Hungarian socialists decided on their own initiative to ally themselves with the newly founded Communist Party of Hungary under the leadership of Béla Kun. Although the Social Democratic Party was infinitely more powerful than the unknown party of the communists, its leaders affected the communist platform without much discussion and dissent. This included the establishment of the system of the Soviets, the abolition of the private property, and the introduction of dictatorship of the proletariat. Within the new government, however, the socialists remained the dominant force. During Béla Kun's 133 days in office, they were constantly in the forefront of the political life, quote ends. By collapse of the socialist-communist coalition, an era has been ended that offered the opportunity or the possibility to create a democratic Hungary. The forces of the counter-revolution, I mean the Horthy regime, prevailed and remained in power for some 25 years. They began with a series of terrorist actions, and then, with Miklos Horthy in power, arrests, trials, and several sentences. All those who had fought for democracy and political rights in the revolutions, or even earlier, were in danger. There was almost only one way to escape, this is immigration. The number of immigrants abroad has increased, mainly in Austria, of course, more specifically in the capital, Vienna. The leading personality and chief ideology to the Social Democratic Center was Zsigmond Kunfi, the most brilliant and complex figure of the Hungarian working class movement. The events in Hungary proved that it was the immigrants who had to start the fight against the counter-revolution led by Horthy. This was done while the Social Democratic immigration itself was organized in two groups. Antal was grouped around the supporters of pre-1980 social democratic political practice, while the mentioned Zsigmond Kunfi and others, for instance, Vilmos Böhm, were grouped around those social democrats who had played an active role in shaping of the politics of the Hungarian Soviet Republic of 1919. So the main counterpoint was the 1990 revolution. Those who gathered around Garami didn't function as an organization group, but a loose table and didn't join any of the internationalist tendencies. The decisive action against Horthy's regime also implied some kinds of reconciliation between the mentioned two social democratic groups. In 1920, the social democratic emigration agreed that its task was to organize the fight against the counter-revolution and to inform the foreign countries and comrades about the activities of the counter-revolutionary Horthy regime in Hungary. The exposure of the system and the analysis of the problems of the period continued in the Vienna process. More than half a year earlier than the Eötvös Future, edited by Garami, and Világosság or Clarity, edited by Zsigmond Kunfi, appeared. The difference in timing of the launch of the two papers also show the differences in their positions of the two social democratic groups in Vienna. The immigrants generally had to survive in difficult financial circumstances, taking all kinds of jobs and relying on aid. The Világosság or Quality group, led by Kunfi, and sharing many of the same views of the Social Democratic Workers' Party of the Austria, enjoyed the support of that party and was able to produce its newspaper until the spring of 1921. The Világosság or Quality saw it as an important task to find suitable work opportunities for the thousands of organized workers who had emigrated. The group's leaders were supported in this difficult but vital work by the leaders of the Austrian party and trade unions in many ways. And the Világosság or Quality group, building on its international contacts, took moral and political responsibility for the Hungarian workers who came to work in various European countries. The Világosság or Quality group worked politically and theoretically in the spirit of Austro-Marxism and Austrian Social Democratic Party. Among its leaders, Kunfi Böhm and Zoltán Rónai, were also involved in the activities of the Social Democratic Workers' Party of Austria, and members of the group were urged to join the Austrian party individually. This close cooperation led to the Világosság or Quality group becoming a member of the International Working Group of Socialist Parties, which was founded in Vienna. The Világosság or Quality group undertook the heritage of 1990, but rejected very strictly the implementation of socialism by dictatorial methods. In its opinion, there was a strong demand among organized labor at the time for a takeover of political governmental power, for the suppression or even expropriation of capital, which had caused the war and death of millions, and for the creation of workers' power. Making some conclusions at the end. The socialist fragments of Austro-Hungarian monarchy were able to rely on each other, but the far-right and the emerging fascism between the two world wars swept away both trends. The Hungarian social democratic immigrants were oppressed by the Horthy regime after 2020, and the Hungarian Social Democratic Party at home made a questionable compromise, this is Betlen-Peyer Pact, with the regime. At the same time, the Austrian politics took a radical turn in 1927. The conservative forces intensified their attacks on Red Vienna thereafter. Due to the post-monarchian Wehrmanization, the Austrian and Hungarian social democracy has damaged and have been swept away by the emerging fascism. At the same time, after the Second World War, neoliberalism will subordinate the social democracy and any movement trying to be critical with capitalism. It is to say that neoliberalism had its ideological and intellectual and theoretical roots in the period after the fall of Austro-Hungarian monarchy, as well as fascism. As the famous Hungarian poet Attila József put very sharply, put an emphasis on very sharply, even in 1930, by saying that capital and fascism are engaged in our time, unfortunately. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Attila, for this extremely interesting contribution. Now I would like to open the floor for questions. We have 15 minutes, and I'm sure we will have some interesting questions. So, yes, Stefan Kuzmica.
Thank you very much. This was extremely interesting, and I really liked your tracing of the kind of entanglements from the Austrian and Hungarian context. I think it's very welcome. And I have some more questions on that, namely, so I kind of know better the communist perspective because that's what I've dealt with. So I know that, you know, the interpretations of the Hungarian Soviet Republic, you kind of had the standard Leninist interpretation that it failed because they collectivized the land instead of giving it to the peasants. And then you have the kind of Béla Kun, so let's call it ultra-left explanation that the Soviet Republic failed because of the Social Democrats. But how did the Social Democrats see it later on? What did Kunfi think, especially somebody who, as you said, opposed the dictatorship of the proletariat. He was part of one. So how did he reflect on that? And by extension, what did the Austro-Marxists think of all that? What was their view of the Hungarian Soviet Republic?
Thank you. Do we collect or? Yes. Yes. Thank you for that observation. It's very, very important. And I would say that the 1990s regime was the main challenge from political and theoretical point of view for the Hungarian historical social democracy. And I would say that after that, they wasn't able to recover from it. Take a look at the mentioned. I said a few words about the Bethlen-Payer Pact, the agreement between the Horthy regime, I would say, and it's a crucial point to understand the situation, the pre-war and interwar Hungarian social democracy. That, of course, from the establishment of the party 1890, it was one of the main and massive party of the historical parties, but from ideological point of view and theoretical point of view, they felt that they are not enough. They haven't enough power to catch the government after the fall of the monarchy. So they tried to seek ideological partner and political partner, and that's because of they support the 1990 coalition. On the other hand, it is also very important that the Károlyi regime, the revolution of 1980, was also frightening for them because of the liberal power. So they hesitated. What is the better, to make a coalition with the bourgeoisie, with the liberal power, or get a coalition with the emerging communists? And the history proved that from some manner there was internal debates and internal cleavage inside the 1990 coalition, and it has become a turning point, the relationship between the communist and social democratic forces in Hungary. And it is very interesting phenomenon that not just the Horthy regime, but after the Second World War, the emerging communist regime took the Social Democratic Party as a main challenge, or political and ideological challenge. And that's why after the Second World War, the Social Democrats made a new pact with the emerging communist party, and that's we can say that it was the last agreement between the Social Democrats and the Communist Party. But you very true that you mentioned that it was a huge political and intellectual challenge for Zsigmond Kunfi, and that's why the immigration was one solution for these guys, because the Hungarian political situation, because of the Horthy regime and because of the Communist Party, was unbearable for these guys. For instance, the communists went to Moscow. These guys went to Vienna. But it's very, very interesting phenomenon. The fail of the Hungarian social democracy, at least to my intention, wasn't the Second World War period, but this period, because after that they wasn't able to recover from this political loss. Thank you.
Michael Kretke, yes.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you, Attila, for an excellent presentation. I have 3 points of disagreement and 1 question. Let me start with disagreements. 2 minor points. First, I wouldn't include Schumpeter in the Austrian school. He has always been his own man. He's a school in his, a one-man school, if you like, but certainly not in the same range as Mises and Hayek and others. But that's a minor point. Second minor point, the socialist calculus debate was never really concluded. And that part of it that had been dominated for a while by von Mises' attack, well, that's different because it has actually been won by the socialists, the theoretical argument at least, with a Polish Marxist with Oskar Lange in the lead. My third point of disagreement is a little bit major or more important. You're right, the free trade tradition always was around also before and after World War I in the 1920s, 1930s, but it had no impact whatsoever. The period of free trade in the 19th century is very, very brief. Afterwards, you cannot really speak about free trade. In the summer of 1914, what was left of it totally broke down. It was never restored after World War I. And again, it broke down with the great economic crisis starting in 1929. So in the 1920s, 1930s, I think near all economic historians would agree liberalism was a corpse dead in the water, and nobody listened to it and nobody was interested. So I doubt it very much that in Red Vienna in the 1920s, neoliberals had any impact. Well, of course, Mises was around, but he was a lone preacher in the desert. Nobody really listened to them. Hayek has later on always complained about that. So the rise of the Mount Pelerin society of the neoliberal movement comes after World War II and has a lot to do with the completely changed situation, with a wave of nationalizations, with the rise of the welfare states, with international trade regime, which is not really free trade, quite different from that. So I have quite big doubt about whether or not they had already some kind of impact, in particular in the environment of Red Vienna. My question last is the following. I think that or at least my hunch is that the relationship between the Austro-Marxists and the Hungarian, not only the communists, but also the Social Democrats, after 1919 must have been quite tenuous because of resentments. Well, the leaders of the Hungarian Revolution urged the Austro-Marxists to help them to intervene. Béla Kun did this at different occasions, and Otto Bauer always refused and said, we cannot. We'll help you with whatever we have, but we cannot do what you want. We will not rise up. We will not form another Soviet Republic and a Red Army. It will not fight for you. And this was certainly a big clash. And afterwards, I would at least presume that there has always been a kind of resentment against the Austrians who had refused to enter the fray at the moment which was most critical for the Hungarian Soviet Republic. So that's my question, how strong this resentment actually was and what impact it had upon the reception of Austro-Marxist politics, Austro-Marxist ideas in Hungary in the 1920s and maybe even later. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that. Vari, thank you for this excellent observation. I really appreciate for this observation. Of course, Schumpeter it's now school or he's a school. I mean, he was a member of the Vienna's intellectual circle. You have right in terms of the calculation debate. Of course, I do not have enough time to elaborate this debate, but I am dealing with that in my paper. Of course, free trade tradition and the early neoliberalism and impact of Midas in terms you have also right. But my basic assumption here in this project, the neoliberalization of the Kadar regime, was that to investigate the political, theoretical, deep political, theoretical, and cultural framework, how can we investigate this rapid neoliberal turn by the regime changes in the state socialist system? And my hypothesis or my hinge is that we can take very serious the early 20th century's traditions and trying to analyze this situation in terms of Hungary. And according to the question of the regime of 1990s and the relationship with Béla Kun, of course, it's very, very important that the regime of 1990s and this and the communist turn was a tipping point, was a turning point, not just in terms of the Hungarian Social Democrats, but in terms of the region, in terms of the post-Austro-Hungarian monarchy. And this, of course, it's totally right that the role of Béla Kun and other communists can be seen as some kind of burden of the socialist and in some manner in the communist movement, but we can take very seriously, for instance, the role of György Lukács and his intellectual assumptions in terms of the revolution, because this was the very first opportunity to make the political theoretical assumptions into the real world. So I am very critical with this revolution, and I am very critical with the early Lukács writing on that. But we can say that it was a huge opportunity for that people. And for instance, if you take a look at the current tendencies, which are blaming the early 20th century with autocratic phenomena and the communist tendencies, blaming Lukács himself and so on and so forth, we should put an emphasis on the internal factors of this regime, I would say. Thank you for that.